The kitchen junk drawer had everything: rubber bands, a single battery that might still work, a book of S&H green stamps 3 years out of date, and a screwdriver that fit nothing in the house. That drawer was the 1970s in miniature, a decade where nothing got thrown out, nothing got explained, and everything somehow worked. One item sat in garages across the country until the government stepped in and pulled it off the market. Another disappeared from the American landscape so quietly that most people barely noticed it was gone. And somewhere past the halfway mark, something is going to put a taste back in your mouth that you have not thought about in decades. So hit subscribe, because here are 100 things only those who grew up in the 1970s remember. Number 100. The tangled rotary phone cord. Every house had one, and every house had the same problem. The cord started out coiled and tight, and within a month it looked like a knot of spaghetti hanging from the wall. Stretching it around the corner into the hallway was the only way to get a private conversation, and that cord remembered every stretch. It never went back to its original shape. Some families tried to fix it by holding the handset in the air and letting it unwind. It never worked. The phone itself weighed about as much as a brick, and dialing a long number like an area code plus 7 digits took genuine patience. A wrong digit at the end meant starting over. The sound of that dial spinning back was one of the most familiar sounds in any American home, and nobody under 30 has ever heard it. Number 99. The grocery store coin-operated horse ride. Outside every supermarket in the 1970s, near the entrance or just past the exit, a small fiberglass horse sat bolted to a metal stand. A dime was all it took. Drop the coin in the slot, and the horse rocked forward and back for about 90 seconds while tinny Western music played from a speaker the size of a silver dollar. Even the ride did nothing. It went nowhere. The horse had chipped paint in a cracked saddle and one eye that had faded to gray. None of that mattered. For a kid sitting on that horse, clutching the reins with both hands, those 90 seconds were the highlight of the entire grocery run. Some children screamed when the ride stopped. Others refused to dismount until they were physically lifted off. The horses stood outside those stores for years, through rain and sun, and nobody ever fixed the paint. They did not need to. Number 98. Winding a watch every morning. Before quartz movements and digital displays, a wristwatch ran on a tiny coiled spring that needed to be wound by hand. Every morning, before breakfast, the same small ritual: twist the crown between your thumb and forefinger until you felt resistance. Wind it too much and you could damage the mainspring. Wind it too little and the watch lost time by noon. Fathers did it while reading the newspaper. Mothers did it while the coffee percolated. Children who were given their first watch learned the motion from watching their parents, and the pride that came with owning a real watch had nothing to do with telling time. It had everything to do with the daily responsibility of keeping it alive. Nobody charged a watch. Nobody synced it. You wound it, and it ticked, and that was enough. Number 97. The $6 Million Man's slow-motion run. Every playground in the country had at least one kid doing it. The right arm pumped, the legs moved in exaggerated slow motion, and the sound effect came straight from the mouth, a low, rhythmic hum that every child in America recognized. Lee Majors played Colonel Steve Austin, a test pilot rebuilt with bionic parts that gave him superhuman speed and strength. The show ran on ABC from 1974 to 1978, and its influence on recess was total. Kids ran in slow motion across schoolyards, jumped off swings in slow motion, and threw footballs in slow motion. The actual show used the effect to suggest incredible speed. On the playground, it just meant you looked ridiculous and did not care. The sound effect was never printed in any script. Every kid invented their own version, and every version sounded exactly the same. Number 96. Charlie Perfume by Revlon. Shelley Hack walked through the ad in a pantsuit, confident and grinning, and an entire generation of women decided that was how they wanted to smell. Revlon launched Charlie in 1973, and within 2 years it became one of the best-selling fragrances in the world. The scent was floral, a little sharp, and completely unmistakable from 10 feet away. It sat on bathroom counters and bedroom dressers in a tall, narrow bottle with a gold cap. Mothers wore it to work. Older sisters borrowed it without asking. The commercials sold independence more than perfume, and the name itself suggested something relaxed and modern. For a decade, Charlie was everywhere, and then it quietly faded into the discount aisle at the drugstore, replaced by perfumes with French names and higher prices. Number 95. The Atari 2600. In 1977, a black console with fake wood paneling and a single joystick changed what happened in American living rooms after dinner. The Atari 2600 was not the first home video game system, but it was the first one that mattered to most families. The graphics were crude, blocky squares and jagged lines that somehow represented tanks, spaceships, and tennis players. The games came on cartridges the size of a deck of cards, and blowing into the slot when one refused to load became an instinct nobody taught and everybody learned. Space Invaders, Asteroids, Combat, Pitfall. The names alone could restart an argument about who held the high score. Families gathered around the television, fought over the single joystick, and ignored the phone for hours. Before the Atari, the television was something you watched. After it, the television was something you played. That line never uncrossed. Number 94. Shag carpeting. The floors of the 1970s looked like somebody had glued a sweater to the ground. Shag carpet came in every color that decade had to offer. Burnt orange, avocado green, gold, brown, and a dusty rose that showed up mostly in bedrooms. The fibers were long enough to lose small objects in. Coins, Lego pieces, bobby pins, and popcorn kernels disappeared into shag carpet and were never seen again unless the carpet was pulled up entirely. Vacuuming it required a special attachment that most families did not have, so the standard approach was a regular vacuum dragged across the surface while the deeper layers remained a mystery. Some families had shag carpet in the bathroom, which made even less sense than it sounds. When hardwood floors came back into fashion, ripping out shag carpet became a Saturday project in millions of American homes. Number 93. Macrame plant holders. Every porch, every kitchen window, and every living room corner in the 1970s had a plant hanging from a knotted rope cradle. Macrame was the craft hobby of the decade. Women learned it from friends, from library books, and from community classes at the local recreation center. The knots had names like square knot and half hitch, and the projects ranged from plant holders to wall hangings to purses to belts. Craft stores sold jute by the spool in a dozen earthy colors. A single large wall hanging could take a week to finish and covered an entire wall behind the sofa. Plants inside the holders were almost always spider plants or ferns, both of which thrived on neglect, which was fortunate because the macrame was the point. The plant was just along for the ride. Number 92. Sun tea brewing in a jar on the porch. A gallon glass jar filled with water and 4 or 5 tea bags, set outside on the porch railing or the front step where the afternoon sun hit hardest. That was it. No kettle, no stove, no timer. The sun did the work, slow and quiet, and by late afternoon the water had turned the color of dark amber. The jar sat there for hours. Flies landed on the lid. Condensation dripped down the glass. Nobody rushed it. When the tea was ready, it got poured over ice in tall plastic tumblers, sometimes sweetened until it was closer to syrup than tea. The whole process was an act of patience that had nothing to do with the drink and everything to do with the pace of the day. If your family did not make sun tea, your neighbor did. Number 91. The smell of mimeograph paper. Every classroom in the 1970s had a smell that no student has experienced since. The mimeograph machine printed worksheets and tests using a stencil and a solvent-based ink that produced copies with a faintly purple tint and a sharp chemical smell that most people either loved or hated. Teachers handed out stacks of freshly printed pages still damp from the machine, and the first thing every student did was hold the paper up to their nose and breathe in. Nobody told them to do this. It was instinct. The smell was sweet and vaguely intoxicating, which in retrospect makes sense because the solvent contained methanol. The machines were loud, messy, and unreliable, and a teacher who could produce a clean run on the first try had a quiet reputation for mechanical competence that followed them through the building. Number 90. Star Wars action figures. When Star Wars opened in May 1977, Kenner did not have the toys ready. The demand was so enormous that for Christmas that year, Kenner sold an empty box called the Early Bird Certificate Package, a cardboard display stand, some stickers, and a mail-in voucher promising the actual figures would arrive months later. And a parent paid money for a promise, and children accepted it. When the figures finally shipped, the line expanded into dozens of characters, each standing about 3 3/4 inches tall. Kids carried them everywhere: pockets, lunchboxes, coat sleeves. Losing a lightsaber accessory the size of a toothpick was a tragedy. Trading a duplicate stormtrooper for a Boba Fett was diplomacy. The figures were small, cheap, and sturdy, and for a solid 5 years, they were the single most important currency on every school playground in the country. Number 89. The Dorothy Hamill Wedge Haircut. Dorothy Hamill won the gold medal in figure skating at the 1976 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, and within weeks, hair salons across America were booked solid. The style was short in the back, slightly longer on the sides, and it swung when she spun on the ice. It looked effortless. Every girl and woman who walked into a salon that spring carried a magazine clipping or a newspaper photo and said the same thing, like Dorothy Hamill. The cut worked on straight hair, wavy hair, thick hair, and fine hair. It required a blow dryer and a round brush to maintain, and it launched a daily ritual in bathrooms across the country. By the end of 1976, the wedge was the most requested haircut in America, and Dorothy Hamill sold shampoo for years after the gold medal was won. Number 88. Light Bright. A black box with a light bulb inside and a grid of tiny holes on the front. You placed a sheet of black paper over the grid, followed a printed pattern, and pushed small translucent pegs through the paper into the holes. When you turned on the light, the pegs glowed. That was the entire toy. The commercial jingle was impossible to forget. Light Bright, making things with light. Kids spent hours filling in the clown face or the sailboat from the pattern sheets, then ran out of sheets and started making their own designs, which mostly looked like nothing but glowed anyway. The pegs ended up everywhere, in the carpet, between couch cushions, under bare feet at 2 in the morning. A stray peg in the hallway was as predictable as a sunrise. Light Bright required patience, darkness, and a willingness to accept that the finished product never looked like the box. Number 87. The matching bathroom set. The toilet lid had a cover. The floor around the toilet had a contoured rug that wrapped around the base. The tank had a cozy. The tissue box had a crocheted sleeve, and every single piece matched, usually in pink, powder blue, or seafoam green. The 1970s bathroom was the most coordinated room in the house, and nobody questioned it. The lid cover slid sideways if you sat down without adjusting it. The floor rug absorbed things nobody wanted to think about. The tissue box sleeve was often crocheted by a grandmother or an aunt, and it sat on the back of the toilet next to a seashell-shaped soap dish holding a bar of soap that nobody was supposed to use. The whole arrangement existed to make the bathroom feel like a room someone had decorated on purpose, and in the 1970s, it did. Number 86. Shrinky Dinks. A sheet of thin polystyrene plastic, a pair of scissors, and a kitchen oven. You colored a picture on the sheet with colored pencils, cut it out, placed it on a baking tray, and watched through the oven window as the plastic curled, twisted, shrank to a fraction of its original size, and then flattened out again into a small, thick, hard version of the drawing. The curling phase caused panic every single time. Kids pressed their faces to the oven glass and held their breath. Parents told them to step back. Nobody stepped back. When the piece came out, it was warm and glossy and solid enough to use as a keychain. The shrinking was the show, and the waiting was the price, and both were worth it. Shrinky dinks were introduced in 1973, and by the mid-1970s they were in most kitchen ovens in the country. Number 85, The Muppet Show. Jim Henson had been putting puppets on television since the 1950s, but nobody expected what happened in the fall of 1976 when The Muppet Show premiered in first-run syndication. The major American networks had all passed on the show, so Henson sold it to a British production company and filmed it at a studio in London. And the result was a variety show hosted by a frog, with a house band led by a dog, a comedy duo featuring a bear and whatever Fozzie was, and a pair of old men in a balcony who heckled the entire production. It should not have worked. It worked completely. The show ran for 5 seasons, and by its second year it was one of the most widely watched entertainment programs in the world. Not in America, in the world. The guest stars ranged from Rudolf Nureyev to Steve Martin, and every one of them played second fiddle to a felt frog with ping-pong ball eyes. The comedy operated on 2 levels at once. Kids laughed at the bad jokes and the Swedish chef's gibberish, while parents caught the sly references and the gentle chaos of Gonzo launching himself from a cannon. Families watched it together on the same couch at the same time and laughed at different things. Kermit's opening line never changed. It's The Muppet Show, with our very special guest star. The theme song was singable after a single listen. The closing number always ended in some kind of disaster, and then it was over, and the credits rolled over Statler and Waldorf delivering one last insult, and everybody went to bed. No streaming, no skipping ahead, 1 episode a week. That was part of what made it matter. Number 84, the aluminum ice cube tray with the metal lever. Before plastic trays with flexible bottoms, ice cubes came from a metal tray with a lever handle running down the center. You filled the tray with water, slid it into the freezer, waited a few hours, and then pulled the lever. The lever was supposed to crack the ice free. In practice, it bent the tray, jammed halfway, and released some cubes while locking others in place. The rest required brute force, banging the tray on the counter, running warm water over the bottom, or prying cubes loose with a butter knife. The cubes themselves were long, narrow, and slightly metallic in taste. They melted faster than modern ice and cracked when they hit warm liquid. Every family had at least 2 trays in the freezer, both partially full, both refilled by nobody. Number 83, the reel-to-reel film projector at school. The lights went off, the projector hummed to life, and for the next 15 minutes the classroom was a movie theater. The film came on a metal reel the size of a dinner plate, threaded through a series of sprockets by a teacher who had practiced the maneuver once and never quite mastered it. The image flickered on a pull-down screen at the front of the room. The colors were faded. The narrator sounded like the track was recorded in 1962. The films covered everything from dental hygiene to the water cycle to the dangers of talking to strangers, and they all had the same mildly ominous tone. The projector ran hot and loud, and the kids seated closest to it could feel the heat on the side of their face. When the film ended, the tail of the reel slapped against the body of the machine in a rhythmic flap that meant the lesson was over and the lights were coming back on. Number 82, Underoos. Underwear with a superhero printed on it. That was the product. The brand licensed characters from DC and Marvel and sold matching tops and bottoms with Superman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, and Batman printed across the chest and waistband. Kids wore them under their school clothes and felt invincible. Some refused to change out of them at night. The television commercials showed children leaping off beds, capes flying, fists raised, and for a few seconds it looked like flight. Underoos launched in 1978 and became one of the fastest-selling children's underwear lines in the country. Parents bought them in packs. Kids outgrew them faster than any other garment in the drawer. The elastic gave out, The print faded. The cape, if there was one, tore at the neck on the first day. None of it mattered. What mattered was the moment before school, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, wearing Superman. Number 81. Pong. The first video game most Americans ever played. Atari released the home version in 1975, and suddenly the television was no longer just for watching, it was for playing. The game was 2 paddles and a square dot bouncing between them, and it was hypnotic. The graphics were nothing but white lines on a black screen. The sound was a flat electronic blip, and it did not need to look impressive, because it was interactive, and nothing on television had ever been interactive before. Families that bought a Pong console connected it to the same set they watched the evening news on, and for a while, arguments about who controlled the TV after dinner shifted from choosing channels to choosing paddles. Pong did not last long. The Atari 2600 arrived by 1977 with cartridge games that made Pong look primitive. But that first evening playing Pong on the living room floor, knees on the shag carpet, was a moment that stuck. Number 80. Door to Door, Encyclopedia Salesman. The doorbell rang on a Saturday morning, and a man in a sport coat stood on the porch holding a sample volume and a payment plan. World Book and Encyclopedia Britannica were the 2 biggest names, and their sales forces covered every neighborhood in the country. The pitch was always the same. Your children needed these books to succeed in school. A full set was a serious investment, and most families bought on a monthly installment plan that stretched over a year or more. The books took up an entire shelf in the living room or the den, and kids were instructed to use them for school reports instead of going to the library. In practice, most families cracked open Volume A during the first week, looked up something like aardvark, and never touched the set again with any real consistency. The books gathered dust beautifully. A full set of Britannica in the original binding is now worth less at a garage sale than the shelf it sits on. Number 79. The Avon Lady. The doorbell rang, and a woman stood on the porch holding a small suitcase full of lipstick, face cream, and perfume samples. Avon had been sending women door to door since the 1880s, but in the 1970s, the Avon Lady was a fixture of neighborhood life. She knew your name, your shade, and what your mother had ordered last time. The catalog was thin and glossy, filled with products that smelled like roses and came in small glass bottles shaped like cars, bells, and chess pieces. The collectible decanters were the real draw. Families displayed them on shelves and windowsills, never opening most of them. The perfume inside eventually turned. Nobody cared. The bottles were the point. Ding dong, Avon calling was the company's tagline, and it was so well known that kids shouted it at every doorbell for a solid decade. Number 78. Love's Baby Soft Perfume. The ad campaign was unmistakable. A young woman holding a teddy bear, photographed in soft focus, with the tagline, "Because innocence is sexier than you think." The perfume smelled like baby powder with a floral edge, and teenage girls in the 1970s treated it like oxygen. It came in a pink bottle and sat on nearly every teenage dresser between 1974 and 1980. The scent was sweet, light, and strong enough to fill a hallway. Girls sprayed it before school, after gym class, and before any event that involved boys. Love's Baby Soft was not expensive and was sold at drugstores and department stores alike. The bottle lasted longer than most friendships at that age. The brand expanded into lip gloss and body lotion, but the original perfume was the one that stuck, the one you recognized in a crowded hallway without looking up. Number 77. The Conversation Pit. A sunken area in the middle of the living room, usually a step or two below the main floor, lined with built-in seating and filled with throw pillows. The Conversation Pit was the architectural signature of the late 1960s and 1970s, designed for face-to-face socializing with no television in sight. Every home design magazine featured at least one version. The reality was less glamorous. Kids used them as wrestling rings. Guests tripped on the step down after a second drink. The built-in cushions collected crumbs and loose change and things that had been missing for months. Cleaning required removing every cushion and vacuuming seams that no attachment could reach. Still, the conversation pit meant something. It meant the house had been built around the idea that people would sit together and talk, face to face, without a screen between them. That idea now feels more foreign than the furniture. Number 76, the Scholastic Book Fair. Once or twice a year, the school library transformed. Long tables appeared, covered in wire racks displaying paperback books with bright covers and prices low enough for pocket change. The Scholastic Book Fair turned the quietest room in the school into the busiest. Kids walked the tables, clutching a few dollars from home, doing math in their heads, trying to figure out if they could afford the mystery novel and the joke book or had to pick just one. The order form was almost as exciting as the fair itself. A folded newsprint sheet listing titles and prices, brought home and handed to a parent with the quiet desperation of a child who had never wanted anything more. The books were not expensive, 50 cents, $1.25. Some of them became the first books a child ever owned outright. Some of them still sit on shelves decades later. Number 75, color forms. Thin vinyl shapes that stuck to a glossy illustrated background without glue, tape, or magnets. Static cling did all the work. The sets came in flat boxes with licensed themes. Batman, Snoopy, Barbie, the Sesame Street characters. You pressed the pieces on the scene, peeled them off, and rearranged them as many times as you wanted. They left no mark. They made no mess. They required no batteries. The vinyl had a specific feel between your fingers. Smooth and slightly tacky, and a faint chemical smell that was impossible to describe but instantly recognizable. Kids played with color forms on car trips, on kitchen tables, and on rainy afternoons when the television had nothing worth watching. The pieces eventually lost their cling and curled at the edges, but a new set cost very little, and every toy aisle had them. Simple, quiet, endlessly reusable. Everything a 1970s toy was supposed to be. Number 74. Vinyl records and the album cover as art. Music in the 1970s was a physical experience. You went to the record store, flipped through bins of 12-inch albums, pulled one out, and studied the cover art before you even heard a note. The cover was part of the purchase. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon had a prism. Led Zeppelin's fourth album had no title at all, just 4 symbols. The Eagles' Hotel California had a photograph of the Beverly Hills Hotel at sunset. You carried the album home, slid the record out of the sleeve, placed it on the turntable, and lowered the needle into the groove. The crackle before the first note was anticipation in audio form. Flipping the record to side B halfway through was a built-in intermission. The sleeve notes, the lyrics printed on the inner sleeve, the smell of fresh vinyl, all of it was part of listening to music. Streaming delivers the sound. It does not deliver anything else. Number 73. The television sign-off. Television did not run all night. At some point after midnight, the programming ended and the station signed off. The process followed the same ritual on nearly every channel. A voice announced that the broadcast day was ending. The national anthem played over footage of an American flag waving in the breeze, and then the screen went to static. That hissing wall of black and white snow was the last thing millions of Americans saw before they fell asleep on the couch. If you woke up at 3 in the morning and the TV was still on, the static was all there was. Some stations showed a test pattern instead, a circular target with an image of a Native American chief that sat motionless on the screen until morning programming resumed. The idea that television could simply stop was completely normal. Today, a streaming service that paused for even 5 minutes would generate a national conversation. Number 72. The world of 1970s television commercials. Television in the 1970s had 3 networks, no remote, and no way to skip the ads. The commercials were not interruptions, they were part of the show. Kids memorized jingles the way they memorized song lyrics, and the slogans embedded themselves so deep that decades later, a single phrase could unlock the whole thing. Ring around the collar. Whisk laundry detergent ran that campaign for years, and the premise was always the same. A wife discovers the dreaded ring on her husband's shirt collar, her social standing collapses, and Whisk saves the day. Mikey likes it. Two brothers push a bowl of Life cereal toward their younger sibling, expecting rejection, and he eats it. That commercial appeared in the early 1970s and stayed on the air for over a decade. My Baloney Has a First Name. Oscar Mayer had children singing jingles that adults could not get out of their heads for weeks. Alka-Seltzer dropped 2 tablets in water and the fizz became a sound effect for a generation. Plop plop, fizz fizz, oh what a relief. It is. The Tootsie Pop Owl asked how many licks it took to get to the center, and nobody ever found out because nobody had that kind of patience. Madge the manicurist soaked her client's fingers in Palmolive dish soap. You're soaking in it. The Jolly Green Giant stood in a valley and said nothing while a small voice whispered, "Ho, ho, ho, Green Giant." These were not background noise. They were shared cultural text. Everyone saw the same ads on the same 3 channels at the same time. There was no algorithm. There was no targeting. There was just a screen, a jingle, and millions of people watching the same thing. Number 71. The Wonder Woman television show. Linda Carter wore the costume and the argument was over. The show premiered on ABC in 1975, moved to CBS in 1977, and ran until 1979. And for those 4 years, Wonder Woman was not a comic book character. She was a television star. Carter spun in a circle and transformed from Diana Prince into Wonder Woman in a burst of light and music. And every girl in the country tried the spin at least once. The golden lasso, the bullet-deflecting bracelets, and the invisible jet were all part of a mythology that children acted out in backyards and living rooms. The show was not subtle. The villains were obvious. The plots resolved in exactly 48 minutes. None of it had to be complicated. A woman who could stop bullets with her wrists was enough. For a generation of girls growing up in the 1970s, Linda Carter was the first superhero who looked like someone they might actually become. Number 70. Corningware casserole dishes. The white dish with the blue cornflower pattern was in every kitchen in America. Corningware was made from a glass ceramic material that could go from the freezer to the oven to the table without cracking. And that versatility made it the most practical piece of cookware a family owned. The blue cornflower design, introduced in 1958, became so common that it was practically invisible. It sat on every potluck table, every church supper, and every counter where a neighbor dropped off a casserole for a family in need. Mothers wrote their initials on the bottom with a grease pencil to make sure the dish came back, because losing a piece of Corningware at a church supper was a genuine social grievance. The dishes were nearly indestructible, which is why so many of them are still in use today, passed down through families like quiet, functional heirlooms. Number 69. The Farrah Fawcett poster. In 1976, a photograph of Farrah Fawcett in a red swimsuit became the best-selling poster in American history. The image was everywhere, taped to bedroom walls, pinned inside locker doors, and hanging in dorm rooms from coast to coast. The poster sold millions of copies and turned Fawcett, already known from her role on Charlie's Angels, into one of the most recognizable faces of the decade. The photograph itself was simple. Fawcett standing in front of a Mexican blanket, smiling, with her feathered hair catching the light. That hairstyle became the most imitated look of the late 1970s. Women brought the poster to their hairdresser and asked for the Farrah. The poster defined an era of celebrity in a way that no single image has managed since. It did not go viral. It went physical, one rolled-up tube at a time, sold at poster shops and department stores for a couple of dollars. Number 68. Quisp cereal, a crunchy, saucer-shaped cereal that tasted similar to Cap'n Crunch but had a mascot from outer space. Quisp was a pink alien with a propeller on his head, and the cereal came in a box that looked like it belonged on a Saturday morning cartoon set. Quaker Oats introduced Quisp and its companion cereal, Quake, in 1965, and the two mascots competed in mock elections and television commercials throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. Quisp won. Quake was discontinued. The cereal itself disappeared from most store shelves by the late 1970s, and its absence made it legendary. Kids who remembered the taste spent years looking for it. The cereal returned in limited runs over the decades, but the original version in the cartoon box on the bottom shelf of the cereal aisle never truly came back. That version belonged to a single decade and stayed there. Number 67. The smell of a fresh box of Crayola crayons. The box opened with a small tearing sound along the cardboard flap, and the smell hit immediately. Warm paraffin wax, faintly sweet, with something earthy underneath that no other product replicated. The 64-count box was the gold standard. It came with a built-in sharpener on the back and colors that no child could name on the first try. Burnt sienna, raw umber, cornflower, maize. Nobody used maize. Everyone used the same 6 or 7 colors until they were nubs, while the rest of the box stayed pristine. The new box smell lasted about a day. After that, the crayons smelled like paper and pockets and the inside of a desk. But that first opening, that first inhale when the box was fresh and every crayon had a perfect point, was one of the purest sensory experiences of an American childhood in any decade. Number 66. Platform shoes. The soles were thick, the heels were high, and walking in them required a level of commitment that bordered on athletic training. Platform shoes hit the mainstream in the early 1970s and stayed for the rest of the decade. Men wore them, women wore them, teenagers wore them to school dances and walked like they were crossing a balance beam. The soles ranged from 2 inches to 5, made of cork, wood, or rubber, and covered in leather, suede, or something that was supposed to look like leather. Elton John wore platforms on stage that looked like they belonged on stilts. The disco floor was full of them. Rolling an ankle was not unusual, and nobody blamed the shoes. Platforms made short people taller and tall people impractical, and they paired with bell bottoms so wide that the entire shoe disappeared beneath the fabric. The style came back more than once, but the originals were taller, louder, and harder to walk in than anything that followed. Number 65. Hot Wheels and the Orange Track. Mattel introduced Hot Wheels in 1968, but the 1970s is when the orange track took over every household. The track came in sections of bright orange plastic that snapped together, and a battery-powered launcher sent die-cast cars rocketing through loops, curves, and jumps at speeds no parent had approved. The cars were small, heavy, and built with low centers of gravity and thin axles designed for velocity. Kids raced them on kitchen floors, down staircase banisters, and off the edge of tables into walls. The track expanded as birthdays and holidays added more sections, and the system grew until it took over entire rooms. A loop that actually worked required careful alignment. A jump that launched the car into the baseboard required none. The cars themselves became collectible, and the ones with Spectraflame paint, a translucent finish over polished metal, were worth more in the schoolyard than anything else in a pocket. Number 64. The Fonz and Happy Days. The show was set in the 1950s, but it belonged to the 1970s. Happy Days premiered on ABC in 1974 and ran for 11 seasons, and while the Cunningham family was the center of the show, Arthur Fonzarelli was the reason anyone watched. The Fonz wore a leather jacket, rode a motorcycle, and could start a jukebox by hitting it with his fist. He said, "Ay," and the studio audience screamed. Henry Winkler played the role with a cool so specific that an entire generation of boys tried to replicate it and failed. Kids greeted each other with the double thumbs up. They slicked their hair back in the bathroom mirror. They hit vending machines hoping for the same result. The Fonz was everywhere. Lunchboxes, t-shirts, posters, and a cultural presence so large that the phrase "jumping the shark" was later coined to describe the moment the show pushed his character too far. Number 63. Carbon paper. A thin sheet coated in dark ink, placed between two sheets of regular paper so that pressing on the top sheet transferred the writing to the bottom one. Carbon paper was how copies got made before photocopiers were cheap enough for every office and household. Typing a letter meant sandwiching a sheet of carbon between the original and the duplicate, rolling all three into the typewriter, and hoping for no mistakes, because correcting an error on the carbon copy was nearly impossible. The paper left ink on fingers, shirt cuffs, and anything it touched. The copies were slightly blurred, always lighter than the original, and smelled faintly of ink. Schools used it. Businesses ran on it. The phrase carbon copy survived the product by decades and still shows up in email as CC. The paper sat in desk drawers through the 1970s and disappeared without ceremony once the copier took its place. Number 62. Getting a busy signal on the phone. Before call waiting, before voicemail, before redial buttons, calling someone whose phone was in use meant hearing a sharp rhythmic beep that told you nothing except that the line was occupied. That was it. No message. No callback. No way to know who they were talking to or how long the conversation would last. You hung up and tried again in 5 minutes, or 10, or an hour. Busy signals were a constant feature of daily life in the 1970s, and teenagers suffered the most. Calling a friend, a date, or the movie theater for showtimes meant dialing, hearing the signal, hanging up, and starting over. Sometimes you got through on the second try. Sometimes it took a dozen attempts. There was no workaround and no shortcut. Patience was not optional in the 1970s. It was built into the phone system. Number 61. The TV Guide magazine, a digest-sized weekly with a close-up portrait on the cover and a complete listing of every show on every channel for the coming week. TV Guide was how families planned their evenings. It arrived in the mailbox each week, and by the next day, someone had already circled the movies and drawn arrows next to the shows worth watching. The listings were printed in small type, organized by time and channel, and reading them required more attention than any streaming menu has ever demanded. The crossword puzzle in the back kept waiting rooms occupied for years. The celebrity profiles were short and direct, and read by more Americans each week than most newspapers reached. By the mid-1970s, TV Guide had one of the highest circulations of any magazine in the country. It sat on coffee tables, end tables, and the top of the television itself, and losing it before Sunday was a household event. Number 60. The flip number clock radio. The numbers were printed on small plastic cards that flipped forward with a soft mechanical click every 60 seconds. The flip clock sat on nightstands and kitchen counters across the country, and it did two things: told time and woke people up with AM radio static. The display was simple: white numbers on a black background, backlit by a small bulb that cast a faint glow across the bedroom. The minute card flipped. The hour card flipped. The AM and PM indicator changed with a quiet snap. There was nothing to set except the alarm, which involved turning a small dial on the back until the correct time aligned with a pointer. Alarm was not gentle. It was the radio at full volume, tuned to whatever station had been playing when the dial was last touched. The flip clock did not care about your morning. It went off and the rest was your problem. Number 59. The wood-burning kit. A heated metal tip attached to a cord, a few blank wooden plaques, and no safety instructions worth remembering. The wood-burning kit was sold in toy aisles and hobby shops, marketed to children, and operated at temperatures high enough to sear skin on contact. The tip glowed orange. The smell of scorched wood filled the room within seconds. Kids pressed the tip into the soft grain of a plaque and traced letters, horses, eagles, and their own names, one slow, smoking line at a time. The finished product was never even. The depth of the burn depended on how long you held the tip in one place, and holding it too long meant a dark crater where a letter was supposed to be. Burns on fingertips were common. Burns on the kitchen table were more common. The kits came with replacement tips in different shapes. Nobody ever used any shape except the standard point. Number 58. The Bionic Woman. Jaime Summers was a tennis pro engaged to Steve Austin until a skydiving accident nearly killed her. The government rebuilt her with a bionic ear, a bionic right arm, and bionic legs, and Lindsay Wagner played her with a warmth and intelligence that made the character feel like more than a spin-off. The Bionic Woman premiered on ABC in 1976 as a companion series to The $6 Million Man, and it quickly built its own audience. The show was different from its parent series, where Steve Austin was stoic and military. Jaime Summers was a schoolteacher who happened to have superhuman strength. She used her bionic ear to eavesdrop on criminals from across a room, threw objects through walls with her arm, and ran in the same slow-motion style that every child already knew from the original show. But the character grounded the fantasy in something more recognizable. She taught school. She had relationships. She struggled with the fact that her body had been rebuilt without her full consent. Girls loved the show, and so did boys, and so did parents. The action was physical but not violent. The stories dealt with loyalty, identity, and the cost of being made into something you did not choose. Wagner won an Emmy for the role and became one of the most recognized faces on American television. The Bionic Woman ran for 3 seasons and 58 episodes, and in that short run it proved something the networks had been slow to understand. A woman could carry a 1-hour action drama, fill the screen on her own, and bring in the same ratings as the man with the bionic arm. Number 57. The AMC Gremlin. American Motors introduced the Gremlin on April 1, 1970, and nobody was sure if the date was a coincidence. The car looked like someone had taken a normal compact sedan and cut off the back half with a hacksaw. The rear end was chopped, the trunk was nearly vertical, and the whole thing sat low and stubby on the road like something assembled from leftover parts. It was cheap. That was the point. The Gremlin sold for under $2,000 in its first year, and for families who needed a second car and could not afford much, it delivered basic transportation without apology. The engine was small, the gas mileage was decent for its time, the interior was stripped down. The design was polarizing in a way that no car has matched since. People either thought it was clever or thought it was ugly, and both camps had a case. The Gremlin stayed in production until 1978 and never stopped looking like it had been interrupted mid-sentence. Number 56. Clapping chalkboard erasers. Every teacher needed someone to do it, and every student wanted to be chosen. Clapping erasers was a privilege, a small reward handed to the well-behaved, and it meant standing outside the school building and slamming 2 felt-bottomed erasers together until the chalk dust billowed out in white clouds. The dust coated your hands, your clothes, your hair, and the lower half of your face. It hung in the air like morning fog. Some kids clapped them against the brick wall of the school, leaving pale rectangles that lasted until the next rain. Others threw them at each other, which ended the privilege on the spot. The ritual disappeared when whiteboards replaced chalkboards in the following decades, and with it went a small, strange honor that required nothing more than 2 blocks of felt and a willingness to get covered in dust. Number 55. The hi-fi stereo as living room furniture. A home stereo system in the 1970s was not a small speaker on a shelf. It was a full-sized cabinet that anchored the living room the way a television does today. The console stereo sat AM/FM radio tuner and speakers built into both ends. Some models had an 8-track player. Later ones added a cassette deck. The cabinet was real wood or wood veneer stained to match the rest of the room, and it weighed enough that moving it required 2 adults and a plan. Families gathered around the stereo to listen to records the way an earlier generation gathered around the radio. The turntable lid doubled as a display surface for family photos, a vase, and a small lamp. When component stereo systems arrived in the late 1970s, with separate pieces stacked on a rack, the console disappeared from living rooms. The separate components sounded better. They never looked as dignified. Number 54. The Bee Gees. For about 3 years in the late 1970s, the Bee Gees were inescapable. The Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, released in 1977, sold over 40 million copies worldwide and turned Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb from a successful pop group into a cultural force. Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, and Night Fever played on every radio station, in every shopping mall, at every school dance, and from every open car window on every warm evening. The falsetto harmonies were polarizing. People either loved them or actively hated them, and both reactions were intense. Disco was already dividing the country into camps, and the Bee Gees became its public face, which meant they also became the target when the backlash arrived. The Disco Demolition Night at Comiskey Park in Chicago in 1979 was partly a music protest, partly a cultural reckoning, and the Bee Gees bore the brunt. Their career recovered, but the brief window when they owned the American airwaves has never been matched by a single group since. Number 53. Green Army Men. A bag of small, solid-colored plastic soldiers, frozen in combat poses, sold for loose change at every toy store, drugstore, and variety shop in the country. Some knelt with rifles, some threw grenades, some crawled on their bellies. One held a mine detector that no child could identify. The figures were always green, always identical, and always missing feet because each one stood on a flat plastic base that snapped off within the first hour of play. Kids dumped them into sandboxes, lined them along windowsills, and arranged them across kitchen floors in elaborate battle formations that a parent's bare foot always found first. They came in bags of 50 or more, and losing a dozen by the end of the week was standard. Green Army Men were disposable, replaceable, and everywhere. Nobody collected them. Nobody saved them. They were just there, like loose change, and nobody questioned why every household had a supply. Number 52. The Rock Tumbler. A small motorized barrel that spun rough stones and grit into polished gems. That was the promise. The reality was a machine that sat on a shelf in the garage or basement, running day and night for weeks, making a grinding noise that carried through every wall in the house. The process required several stages: coarse grit first, then finer grit, then polishing compound, each cycle taking days and requiring a water change. The noise was constant, a low rolling hum that vibrated through countertops and floorboards. Parents relocated the tumbler to the farthest corner of the house and still heard it after midnight. When the stones finally came out, they were smooth, shiny, and noticeably smaller than when they went in. Kids held them up to the light, admired them for about 15 fine minutes, and dropped them into a drawer where they stayed for the next 40 years. The journey was the toy. The rocks were just proof it happened. Number 51. Sizzler. The steakhouse with the salad bar that stretched the length of the dining room. Sizzler opened its first location in the late 1950s, but the 1970s is when the chain became a family institution. The format was simple. Order a steak or a seafood platter at the counter, carry your tray to a booth, and visit the salad bar as many times as your conscience allowed. The salad bar was the real attraction. It offered everything from iceberg lettuce and cherry tomatoes to cottage cheese, beets, croutons the size of dice, bacon bits from a metal bin, and a sneeze guard that performed exactly as well as you would expect. Families went to Sizzler on Friday nights. Birthdays happened there. First dates happened there, and nobody apologized for it. The steak was thin, cooked on a flat grill, and served on a metal plate that stayed hot long enough to keep sizzling through the entire meal. That sizzle was the brand, and it worked. Number 50. Trouble. The board game with the pop-o-matic bubble in the center. Press the plastic dome, and a die inside bounced against the walls with a sharp popping sound that could be heard 2 rooms away. The game was released in 1965, but it lived its loudest decade in the 1970s. The rules were simple. Pop the bubble, move your colored pegs around the board, and send your opponents back to start by landing on their space. The strategy was minimal. The satisfaction of sending someone home was enormous. The pop-o-matic bubble was the entire reason the game existed. The die could not be lost. It could not be thrown across the room. It could not roll under the couch. It sat under a sealed dome, and the only way to use it was to press down and hear the pop. That sound, plastic on plastic, hollow and sharp, was the sound of a 1970s game night starting. Number 49. The Partridge Family Bus, a 1957 Chevrolet school bus painted in bright blocks of red, orange, yellow, blue, and pink, with geometric patterns that made it look like a rolling piece of pop art. The Partridge Family premiered on ABC in 1970, and for the next 4 seasons, a fictional family traveled the country in that bus, playing concerts and resolving problems within 22 minutes. David Cassidy became a teenage idol overnight. Shirley Jones played the mother. The show aired on Friday nights, and the bus became an icon that outlasted the show itself. Kids drew it in notebooks. Models of it were sold in toy stores. The actual bus was a repainted school vehicle that looked nothing like its televised version without studio lighting, but none of that mattered on screen. On screen, the bus meant freedom, music, and a family that did everything together, and the fact that none of it was real did not reduce its hold by a single watt. Number 48. The Bicentennial Minute. Every night from July 1974 through the end of 1976, CBS aired a 60-second segment narrated by a different celebrity, recounting an event from American history that had occurred exactly 200 years earlier on that date. Walter Cronkite, Jessica Tandy, Lucille Ball. Each one read a short script about a battle, a debate, a letter written, or a law passed, and signed off with a variation of the same closing line. 2.5 years. They accumulated like a daily history lesson that nobody asked for and nobody skipped. By the time the series ended, the format had become background rhythm for the entire bicentennial era. 1 minute, 1 date, 1 person reading 1 fact, nothing else needed. Number 47. The Donnie and Marie Variety Show. Donnie was a little bit country. Marie was a little bit rock and roll. That was the premise, and ABC ran with it for 4 seasons starting in 1976. The show featured musical numbers, comedy sketches, and ice skating routines performed on an actual rink built into the studio set. Marie was 16 when the show premiered. Donnie was 18. Both were already famous from years of Osmond family television appearances and hit records, and the variety format gave them a stage large enough to hold it all. The ice skating was the signature, both in matching outfits, gliding through choreography on a studio rink while cameras tracked from overhead. The show was wholesome, bright, and deeply specific to its era. The closing credit sequence ran while they waved. It could not have existed 5 years earlier or 5 years later, and it did not try to. Number 46. Grease. The movie opened in the summer of 1978, and by Labor Day, every teenager in America knew the words to Summer Nights. John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John played Danny Zuko and Sandy Olson, 2 high school students at Rydell High in the late 1950s, and the musical became the highest-grossing film of the year. The songs were everywhere. You're the One That I Want played on every radio station, in every shopping mall, and out of every car window for months. Greased Lightnin' turned the auto shop scene into one of the most replayed musical numbers in film history. Hopelessly Devoted to You crossed from the pop charts to easy listening and stayed. The soundtrack sold tens of millions of copies and became one of the best-selling albums of its kind. But the movie's power was not just in the music. It was in the transformation. Sandy went from a cardigan and a ponytail to black leather, red lipstick, and a cigarette in the final scene, and the audience lost its mind. Girls replicated the look the next morning. Boys combed their hair like Danny Zuko. The Pink Ladies and the T-Birds became Halloween costumes for the next decade. Slumber parties played the movie until the tape wore thin. Grease was set in 1958, but it was a 1970s movie in every way that counted. The music, the style, the humor, and the sheer volume of cultural noise it generated. The drive-in scene, the dance contest, the carnival finale. None of it made logical sense, and none of it needed to. It worked on feeling alone, and that was enough to keep a generation singing for years. Number 45. Space dust candy. The successor to Pop Rocks, sold in small foil packets with a futuristic font and a promise of explosive fizzing on the tongue. The candy hit shelves in the late 1970s and did exactly what the name implied. Pour the powder into your mouth, close your lips, and feel thousands of tiny carbonated explosions across your tongue and the roof of your mouth. Sensation was sharper than Pop Rocks because the granules were finer and the fizz was more immediate. Kids poured entire packets at once and opened wide to show the crackling to anyone standing close enough. Rumors circulated that the candy could make your stomach burst, which was completely false, but the rumor only increased demand. Space dust was eventually renamed Cosmic Candy after concerns about the name sounding too close to something illicit, and it faded from store shelves by the early 1980s. The fizz, though, is still the first thing anyone remembers. Number 44. The TV clicker. Before the remote control became universal, changing the channel on the television meant getting up and walking to the set. The Zenith Space Command, introduced in the 1950s, was one of the earliest wireless remotes, and by the 1970s it had earned the name that every family used, the clicker. It was called that because it used ultrasonic tones produced by small metal rods struck by hammers inside the device, and it made a distinct clicking sound when you pressed a button. The clicker had 2 or 4 buttons and could change the channel, adjust the volume, and turn the set on and off. Losing the clicker meant the youngest person in the room became the remote. Change it to channel 7. Turn it up. That child, stationed next to the television and waiting for instructions, was the human interface between the family and the screen. Number 43. Troll dolls. Small rubber figures with oversized heads, glass eyes, and a shock of brightly colored hair that stood straight up. Troll dolls were originally designed by a Danish fisherman named Thomas Dam in 1959, and by the 1960s and 1970s they were a global phenomenon. Kids collected them by the dozen. The hair came in pink, purple, green, orange, and every other color that did not exist in nature. Some trolls wore outfits, others were completely naked. The appeal was hard to explain and impossible to deny. Troll dolls sat on dashboards, dangled from keychains, perched on desks, and lived in pockets. They were considered good luck charms by some and simply amusing by others. The dolls went through multiple waves of popularity, disappearing for a few years and then surging back. The originals from the 1960s and 1970s, with their soft rubber bodies and glass inset eyes, are now collector's items that sell for amounts that would have been unthinkable when they were first pulled from a toy bin. Number 42. The K-Tel Record Collection. As seen on TV. The commercials came on late at night or during Saturday afternoon reruns, and the announcer spoke at double speed, 20 original hits, 20 original stars. K-Tel Records sold compilation albums through television ads, stacking familiar songs from different artists onto a single vinyl disc. The albums had names like Goofy Greats, Music Express, and Night Fever, and the covers were packed with more colors than a crayon box. The songs were sometimes trimmed to fit more tracks on the record, cutting a chorus or shortening an intro without warning. Nobody minded. For the price of a single album at a record store, you got 20 songs, and the appeal of hearing Elton John alongside the Bee Gees alongside Casey and the Sunshine Band on the same record was hard to resist. K-Tel. Albums sat in every record collection, wedged between the serious albums, and they got played more often than any of them. Number 41. The record player in school. Every classroom and every school library had one. A portable record player in a hard plastic case with a hinged lid that doubled as a speaker. It was beige or gray, built like a small suitcase, and nearly indestructible. Teachers used it for everything: music class, read-along records with picture books, film strip soundtracks, and the occasional Friday afternoon reward of listening to a full album. The needle was thick enough to survive being dropped on the record by a 6-year-old, and the sound quality was exactly what you would expect from a speaker the size of a sandwich. The records that came with the read-along books had a tone that told you when to turn the page, and that single ding is a sound that anyone who attended elementary school in the 1970s can still hear in their head without trying. Number 40. The patchwork quilt. Every bed in the house had one, or at least every bed that mattered. A heavy blanket made from squares of leftover fabric, stitched together by hand or on a sewing machine, with batting inside thick enough to get through a winter without turning up the thermostat. Grandmothers made them. Mothers inherited them. Kids dragged them off the bed and built forts with them on the living room floor. The patches came from old dresses, worn-out shirts, kitchen curtains that had been replaced, and fabric scraps bought from the remnant table at the fabric store. No two quilts matched. Each one was a record of the family wardrobe from the last 10 years, stitched into a blanket heavy enough to pin a child to the mattress. The binding frayed. The batting clumped. The corners lost their shape. None of it mattered, because the value of the quilt had nothing to do with how it looked and everything to do with who sat at the machine and sewed it. Number 39. The Betamax and VHS War. In the mid-1970s, two competing formats tried to become the standard for home video recording, and the battle between them divided households. Sony released Betamax in 1975. JVC released VHS in 1977. Betamax had better picture quality. VHS had longer recording times. The war should have been decided on merit. It was decided on availability. VHS recorders were licensed to dozens of manufacturers, which drove prices down and flooded the market. Betamax stayed exclusive to Sony and a handful of partners. Video rental stores stocked both formats at first, then started favoring VHS because that was what most customers owned. By the early 1980s, the outcome was clear. VHS won, and Betamax became a cautionary tale about the dangers of a closed system. Families who had invested in Betamax watched their tape collections become incompatible with the rest of the world, which was an early lesson in what would later be called technology lock-in. Number 38. The Chia Pet. Chia! The jingle was inescapable. A hollow terracotta figure shaped like a ram, a puppy, a bull, or a human head, coated in chia seeds that sprouted into green fur when watered. The Chia Pet arrived in 1977 and became one of the most reliable holiday gifts in American retail for the next 3 decades. The growing process took about 2 weeks. Soak the seeds, spread them on the grooved surface, add water to the hollow base, and wait. The sprouts grew unevenly. One side of the ram would be lush, while the other stayed bare. The head shapes grew hair in patches that no barber could fix. The results never matched the photo on the box, and nobody expected them to. The Chia Pet was not a gardening tool and not really a toy. It was a novelty that sat on a kitchen windowsill, produced patchy green sprouts for a few weeks, and then quietly died. And then someone gave you another one for Christmas. Number 37. The Photomat Kiosk. A tiny drive-through booth in the corner of a shopping center parking lot shaped like a small pyramid with a pitched gold roof. You drove up to the window, handed over your roll of exposed film, and came back the next day or the day after to pick up your printed photographs. The Photomat attendant sat inside a space barely large enough for a chair and a filing system, surrounded by envelopes of processed film organized by customer name. The booth was open rain or shine, summer or winter, and the person inside had no restroom, no heat in some cases, and no company. Photomat was everywhere in the 1970s, with thousands of kiosks across the country. The franchise declined rapidly in the 1980s when one-hour photo labs inside drugstores and shopping malls made the wait unnecessary. The kiosks disappeared. Some were converted into espresso stands. Most were simply torn down, leaving behind a small concrete pad in the corner of a parking lot that no one remembers the purpose of. Number 36. The Coleman Cooler. Green metal with a silver lid and a lever latch that snapped shut with a sound that meant the family was going somewhere. The Coleman Cooler went to every picnic, every beach trip, every campsite, and every tailgate in the 1970s. It was heavy even when empty, filled with ice, sandwiches, cans of soda, and a bag of grapes that nobody ate. It took 2 hands and a strong back to lift into the car. The ice lasted about a day before turning into cold water that soaked the bottom layer of food. Reaching into the cooler meant plunging your arm into ice water up to the elbow to find the last can of root beer at the bottom. The cooler doubled as a seat, a table, and a step stool at campsites. Coleman made them to last, and they did. Families passed the same cooler down through decades. The green paint chipped, the hinges rusted. The cooler kept working. Number 35. Keep on Truckin'. Robert Crumb drew it in 1968 for Zap Comics, a figure with enormous feet striding forward with exaggerated confidence, one leg stretched far ahead of the other. The phrase "keep on truckin'" was scrawled above, and by the early 1970s the image was on everything. T-shirts, bumper stickers, mud flaps, van murals, dorm room posters. The phrase and the walking figure became shorthand for easygoing persistence, and people who had never opened an underground comic recognized the striding man immediately. Crumb grew to resent the image in its commercial afterlife and fought legal battles over its unauthorized reproduction. The drawing appeared on products he never approved, in places he never intended, and became the most widely copied piece of American underground art of its time. By the mid-1970s, Keep on Truckin' was less an illustration and more a national mood, printed on anything that could hold ink and sold by anyone with a screen printing setup. Number 34. Open air in the truck bed. The back of a pickup was a perfectly acceptable place to put your children in the 1970s. Families did it on the way to the lake. Neighbors did it on the way to the dump. Kids sat on the wheel wells or lay flat against the ribbed metal floor with their hair blowing and their eyes watering from the wind. There were no seatbelts back there, and nobody expected any. The truck went 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, and the only thing between the passengers and the road was a tailgate held shut by a pin. It felt like freedom in its purest form. The wind hit your face and the sun hit your arms, and every bump in the road launched you an inch off the truck bed. It was also, by any modern safety standard, extraordinarily dangerous. Most states have since passed laws prohibiting passengers from riding in the bed of a moving pickup. The practice has not vanished entirely in rural areas, but it is no longer the casual, everyday occurrence it was in 1974. Number 33. Playing records backward to find hidden messages. The rumor started with the Beatles and never stopped. If you placed the needle on a vinyl record and spun the turntable backward by hand, you could supposedly hear secret messages buried in the music. Kids across the country spent hours in basements and bedrooms, pressing their fingers against the edge of a spinning record to reverse it, listening through static and distortion for words that sounded like language. Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven was the most analyzed track. Queen's Another One Bites the Dust was a close second. The messages people claimed to hear ranged from sinister to absurd, and the evidence was always just plausible enough to keep the experiment alive. Most of the time, the reversed audio sounded like garbled noise, but every now and then, a syllable lined up. A vowel shaped itself into something that resembled a word, and the room went completely silent. Number 32. The Hang in There Cat Poster. A photograph of a small kitten dangling from a horizontal bar by its front paws, wide-eyed and slightly frantic, with the words "Hang in there, baby" printed across the bottom. The poster was everywhere in the 1970s. Classroom walls, office break rooms, dentist waiting areas, and the bedroom doors of teenagers who had no idea the image would still be recognizable half a century later. The original photo was taken in 1971, and it became one of the most reproduced motivational images in American history. The message was simple. The cat looked like it was about to fall, but it was holding on. That was the entire point. Schools pinned it above drinking fountains. Offices taped it beside the time clock. And the poster survived parody, satire, and decades of changing taste, and it still appears on walls today, because the expression on that kitten has not aged a single day. Number 31. Puka shell necklaces. Small white shells strung on a cord and worn around the neck. Puka shells came from Hawaii, and by the mid-1970s they had become the single most popular piece of jewelry among teenagers on both coasts and everywhere in between. Boys and girls wore them. Surfers wore them first, then everyone else followed. The necklaces were sold at beach shops, department stores, and by mail order, and the price ranged from a few dollars for a thin strand to considerably more for a thick, heavy choker made from perfectly matched shells. Wearing a puka shell necklace in 1976 said something about the wearer. Casual, outdoorsy, connected to a California aesthetic that most of the country experienced only through television and magazines. The trend faded by the early 1980s, replaced by gold chains and leather cords. The shells ended up in jewelry boxes and dresser drawers, where many of them still sit today, yellowed and brittle but still unmistakable. Number 30. Gee, your hair smells terrific. That was the actual name of the shampoo. It arrived on store shelves in the early 1970s, and the name was the entire marketing strategy. The bottle was orange, the scent was sweet and floral, and strong enough to linger in a school hallway for an hour after someone walked past. The shampoo was aimed at teenage girls, and it hit the target cleanly. The name was ridiculous enough to be unforgettable and specific enough to function as a dare. Boys who paid the compliment out loud discovered that the product had done something no shampoo before it had managed. It gave teenagers a scripted pickup line. Gee, your hair smells terrific, was corny, but it was also exactly what the television commercial instructed you to say, and the fact that it occasionally worked was a tribute to the power of naming a product after the reaction you wanted. The shampoo disappeared from shelves by the early 1980s. The name is still funnier than anything in the beauty aisle today. Number 29. The Magic 8-Ball. A black plastic sphere the size of a grapefruit with a small clear window on the bottom. Ask a question out loud, shake the ball, turn it over, and a blue triangle floated to the surface of a dark liquid with a printed answer. Signs point to yes. Reply hazy. Try again. Don't count on it. The toy had been around since the 1950s, but it was a fixture of 1970s bedrooms and basement rec rooms. Kids asked it everything, whether they would pass the math test, whether a crush liked them, whether they would grow up to be astronauts. The answers were random. Everyone knew the answers were random. That did not stop anyone from shaking it a second time when the first answer was unfavorable. The Magic 8-Ball was the original algorithm, a system that generated answers without understanding the question, trusted only when it told you what you already wanted to hear. Number 28. The Easy Bake Oven. A small metal oven the size of a bread box, powered by a single incandescent light bulb that generated just enough heat to bake a tiny cake in a round metal pan. Kenner introduced it in 1963, but the Easy Bake lived its best years through the 1970s. The cake mixes came in packets barely larger than a sugar packet, and the finished product was about the diameter of a hockey puck and roughly the same density. Baking took about 30 minutes, and the result tasted like sweetened flour with a faint warmth. Nobody cared about the taste. The point was the process: measuring, mixing, sliding the pan into the slot, and watching through the small window while the light bulb did its slow, patient work. Kids served the results to parents on paper plates with the gravity of a formal dinner presentation. The parents ate every crumb and said it was delicious, because that was the unwritten rule of the kitchen. Number 27. Nerf balls. Parker Brothers released the first Nerf ball in 1970, and the tagline was simple: Throw it indoors. You can't damage lamps or break windows. You can't hurt babies or old people. The original was a 4-inch polyurethane foam ball that weighed almost nothing and could be thrown, kicked, and bounced off walls without consequence. It was the first indoor ball that parents actually allowed in the house. The Nerf football followed in 1972 with a spiral design that made it easier to throw than a real football and soft enough to catch without gloves. Kids threw them in the living room, in the hallway, and across the kitchen table. The foam absorbed impact, which meant that the occasional lamp was in fact spared. The Nerf brand expanded into dart guns, basketball hoops, and an entire product line built on the original premise: safe enough for the house, fun enough for the yard. Number 26. The Flip Wilson Show. Flip Wilson hosted the top-rated variety show on NBC from 1970 to 1974, and for those 4 years he was one of the most recognized comedians on American television. The show ran on sketches, musical guests, and original characters that entered the national vocabulary. Geraldine Jones, Wilson's most famous creation, was a bold, sharp-tongued woman who delivered catchphrases like, "The devil made me do it," and "What you see is what you get," with a timing so precise that both lines passed into everyday speech. The show won Emmy Awards and drew guest appearances from athletes, musicians, and actors who rarely appeared on variety programs. Wilson performed without a net. No cue cards, no teleprompter for his monologues. The humor was clean, fast, and physical, and the studio audience laughter was genuine and often louder than the punchlines themselves. When the show ended, Wilson stepped away on his own terms, and nothing quite replaced what he had built on that stage. Number 25. The Smell of Coppertone. Before SPF ratings and dermatologist warnings, sun protection in the 1970s meant one thing: Coppertone. The lotion came in a dark brown bottle with the iconic image of a little girl and a puppy tugging at her swimsuit, and the smell was coconut and summer distilled into a cream. Every pool bag, every beach towel, and every picnic basket in America had a bottle. Mothers applied it to the backs of necks and the tops of ears before anyone understood what UV radiation actually did to skin. The goal was not to prevent a sunburn. The goal was to get a tan. A deep brown tan was considered healthy, attractive, and proof that you had spent the summer outside. Coppertone facilitated the tan more than it prevented the burn, and nobody questioned that arrangement. The smell lingered on skin and towels for days, and catching a trace of it today is enough to bring back an entire July afternoon by the municipal pool. Number 24. Simon. Milton Bradley released Simon in 1978, and it became one of the first electronic games to dominate the toy market. The device was a round disc about the size of a dinner plate with 4 colored panels: red, blue, green, and yellow. Each panel lit up and played a tone, and the game's only challenge was to repeat the sequence. Simon played a pattern. You repeated it. Simon added one more step. You repeated again. The sequences started easy and got longer until you missed one and the game blared, a harsh buzzing sound that announced your failure. The game was addictive in a way that required no story, no characters, and no imagination, just memory and reflexes. Families passed it around at parties. Kids played it on the floor of their bedrooms for hours. The electronic tones that Simon produced are instantly recognizable to anyone who played it, even decades later. Number 23. The pull tab that came all the way off the can. Before the stay-on tab, opening a can of soda or beer meant peeling a small aluminum ring upward and backward until the entire tab detached with a sharp snap. The tab came off in your hand, and there were 2 options. Drop it inside the can where it sank to the bottom, or drop it on the ground where it joined millions of others on beaches, in parking lots, and across stadium bleachers. The detachable tab was a litter problem so widespread that environmental groups spent years lobbying for a redesign. Kids collected them in jars, some strung them into chains. Others stepped on discarded tabs barefoot and learned a fast lesson about aluminum edges. The stay-on tab replaced them by the early 1980s, But for a full decade, every soda and every beer required a small act of separation before the first sip, and the sharp little disc left behind was as common on the ground as a bottle cap, a set of interlocking plastic plates with raised clothing designs, a crayon, and a sheet of paper. You chose a top plate, a bottom plate, and an accessory plate, snapped them together in a plastic tray, laid paper over the surface, and rubbed a crayon across the top. The raised design transferred onto the paper like a gravestone rubbing, and the result was a fashion sketch that looked like it came from a department store catalog. The toy was released in the late 1970s and marketed primarily to girls, though anyone who tried it found that the satisfaction of watching an image emerge under a crayon had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the simple pleasure of making something appear from a blank sheet. The plates snapped together in different combinations, and the possible outfits numbered in the hundreds. Most of them clashed. All of them were satisfying to reveal. Number 21. Holly Hobbie. A girl in a patchwork bonnet and a long calico dress, always shown in profile, became one of the most recognizable characters of the 1970s. Holly Hobbie was created by artist Denise Holly Olinskas as a greeting card illustration for American Greetings, and the character appeared on everything: plates, lunchboxes, bedspreads, curtains, wallpaper, dolls, and easy-bake oven sets. The appeal was nostalgic even in the 1970s. Holly Hobbie represented a simpler, rural America that most kids had never experienced, and the character's wholesome country aesthetic was the opposite of the decade's urban edge. Girls who collected Holly Hobbie merchandise often had entire bedrooms decorated in the character's patchwork style. The dolls wore cloth bonnets and carried baskets. The imagery always included flowers, fences, and kittens. It was sweet, earnest, and commercially enormous. Holly Hobbie merchandise generated hundreds of millions in sales during the 1970s, all from a single illustration of a girl in a bonnet who never showed her face. Number 20. The Water Wiggle. A rubber hose attachment shaped like a character head that connected to a garden hose and whipped around wildly when the water was turned on. Wham-O sold the Water Wiggle starting in the 1960s, and by the early 1970s it was a fixture in backyards across the country. The toy was simple: turn on the water, and the rubber head flew in unpredictable circles at high speed, spraying in every direction while dragging the hose behind it. The problem was that the hard plastic nozzle inside the rubber head hit with real force. Kids chased it, got struck in the face, and chased it again. It knocked over lawn, furniture. It tangled in clotheslines. It left welts on bare skin. The product was eventually pulled from the market after safety concerns, and the version sold in the 1970s was recalled. The Water Wiggle is one of those toys that sounds completely invented when you describe it to anyone born after 1985. It was not. Number 19. Click-clacks. Two heavy acrylic balls attached to a string with a tab in the middle. You held the tab and swung the balls up and down so they clacked together above and below your hand in a continuous rhythm. The sound was exactly what the name promised: a loud, sharp clacking that could be heard from across a school cafeteria. The balls were hard enough to shatter under stress, and when they did, they sent sharp plastic fragments in every direction. Injuries were common enough that the Consumer Product Safety Commission issued warnings, and many schools banned them outright. None of this reduced their popularity among kids, who treated the ban as a challenge. Click-clacks were sold under several names and were one of the most controversial toys of the early 1970s. Beloved by children, dreaded by teachers, and genuinely dangerous in a way that no modern toy manufacturer would tolerate for a single day. Number 18. Estes Bottle Rockets. A cardboard tube, a balsa wood nose cone, a plastic fin assembly, and a solid fuel engine that launched the whole thing several hundred feet into the air on a column of white smoke. Estes rockets were sold at hobby shops and came in kits that required glue, paint, and a few hours of careful assembly. The launch itself was the reward. You slid the rocket onto a thin metal rod, connected the ignition wires to the engine, stood back a safe distance, and pressed the button. The rocket left the ground with a hiss and a roar that was wildly disproportionate to its size. At the top of its arc, a small charge popped the nose cone and deployed a plastic parachute that floated the rocket back to Earth. Finding the rocket after it landed was a separate adventure that sometimes involved climbing trees, crossing fences, and knocking on a neighbor's door. Some rockets were never recovered. Every kid who launched one understood that the sky was not just something you looked at. It was somewhere you could send things. Number 17. The Neighborhood Diner. Not a franchise, not a chain. A small, locally owned restaurant with a counter, a row of booths, and a menu written on a board behind the register in letters that had not changed in 20 years. The Neighborhood Diner in the 1970s was a third place before anyone had a word for it. It was where the regulars sat at the same stool every morning, and the waitress poured their coffee without being asked. Breakfast was 2 eggs, toast, hash browns, and a cup of coffee for a price that would not register on a modern receipt. The cook worked a flat-top grill visible from the counter, and the sound of eggs and bacon hitting the surface was the opening act of the morning. The diner served the same meal to the electrician in the booth by the window and the retired postman at the end of the counter. There were no reservations and no pretension. You sat where there was room, and if there was no room, you waited by the door and talked to whoever was waiting next to you. Lunch was a burger or a club sandwich. Pie was always available. The coffee was always hot, always weak, and always refilled without being asked. The diner knew its customers not by name tags or loyalty programs, but by memory. The waitress remembered that Harold took his eggs over easy and that Mrs. Patterson wanted her toast dark. That kind of service was not a selling point. It was just how the place operated. By the 1980s and 1990s, chain restaurants and fast food franchises began replacing the independent diner on main streets across the country. The economics were simple. A chain could buy in bulk, advertise nationally, and undercut the local place on price. The diners that survived did so because their regulars refused to leave. The ones that closed took something with them that no franchise has ever replaced: the quiet daily ritual of sitting in a familiar place, being known, and eating a simple meal prepared by someone who had been making it the same way for longer than most of the customers had been coming in. Number 16. Tab and Fresca. Before Diet Coke existed, the diet soda market belonged to 2 drinks that tasted like nothing on the market today. Tab was Coca-Cola's first diet soda, introduced in 1963, and by the 1970s it was the drink of choice for every weight-conscious adult in America. The can was pink and white, and the taste was bitter, metallic, and vaguely sweet in a way that took commitment to enjoy. People who loved Tab loved it fiercely. Fresca was the other option, a grapefruit-flavored, sugar-free soda that came in a green can and tasted lighter and sharper than Tab. Both drinks sat in the refrigerator of almost every home in the 1970s, next to the orange juice and the whole milk. Tab was discontinued in 2020 after decades of declining sales. Fresca is still around but hard to find in some markets. Neither one tastes quite the way memory suggests they should. Number 15. The kitchen wall phone. Mounted at shoulder height next to the refrigerator or beside the doorway to the dining room, the wall phone was the communication center of the 1970s household. It was usually a rotary dial model in a color that matched the kitchen: avocado green, harvest gold, or plain white. The handset hung from a cradle, and the cord stretched just far enough to reach the kitchen table, but not quite far enough to reach the hallway for a private conversation. When the phone rang, it rang loud. There was no caller ID, no voicemail, and no way to screen the call. You picked it up and said hello, and whoever was on the other end could be anyone from Aunt Dorothy to a wrong number to a salesman offering magazine subscriptions. Dinner was interrupted. Homework was interrupted. Arguments were interrupted. The phone rang when it rang and somebody answered it, because that was the rule. Number 14. Space food sticks. Pillsbury introduced them in 1970, riding the wave of public fascination with the Apollo missions, and the packaging made one thing clear: this was the food that astronauts ate. The sticks were about the size of a thin candy bar, individually wrapped in foil, and came in flavors like chocolate, peanut butter, and caramel. The texture was dense and chewy, somewhere between a Tootsie Roll and a granola bar, and the taste was sweet enough to pass as a treat even though the marketing positioned them as nutrition. Kids ate them after school, in lunchboxes, and on road trips, believing they were consuming the same fuel that powered a trip to the moon. The connection to the space program was the entire selling point, and once the public's interest in space travel cooled in the mid-1970s, space food sticks quietly disappeared from store shelves. The taste is hard to describe to anyone who never tried one, and impossible to forget for anyone who did. Number 13. Iron-on transfers for t-shirts. A design printed on a sheet of waxy paper, placed face down on a plain t-shirt, and pressed with a hot household iron for about 30 seconds. When you peeled the paper away, the image was on the fabric. Iron-on transfers were sold at department stores, novelty shops, and state fairs, and the designs ranged from rock band logos to cartoon characters to slogans that no parent should have allowed near a child. The process was not reliable. Too much heat melted the image into a blurred smear. Too little left it half attached and peeling at the corners by lunchtime. The transfers cracked after a few washes, fading into a ghost of the original that you kept wearing anyway because you had put it there yourself. Custom t-shirts did not exist in the 1970s the way they do now. If you wanted your shirt to say something specific, you laid out the paper, heated the iron, pressed hard, and lived with whatever came off the backing. Number 12. Brut Cologne by Fabergé. The dark green bottle sat on the bathroom shelf, and the scent was everywhere, in hallways, in cars, on shirt collars, and in elevators for minutes after the man who wore it had already stepped out. Brut launched in 1964, but the 1970s made it ubiquitous. Joe Namath endorsed it. The cologne was marketed as masculine, confident, and impossible to miss, and that last description was completely accurate. A single application lasted all day, and a heavy application lasted well into the next morning. The scent was musky, sharp, and sweet at the same time, and it announced a man's presence before he entered the room. Fathers wore it, uncles wore it, teenage boys borrowed it from the medicine cabinet and applied it like water before school dances. The green bottle came in, aftershave, cologne, deodorant, and a gift set that appeared under Christmas trees across the country every December. The shape of the bottle never changed. The scent never softened. Brut did not ask for subtlety, and it never received any. Number 11. The After School Special. From the early 1970s through the late 1980s, the major television networks aired original movies in the afternoon aimed at children and teenagers, and the topics were nothing a child was prepared for. Divorce, drug use, alcoholism, bullying, teen pregnancy, eating disorders, running away from home. The after-school special tackled every uncomfortable subject that parents struggled to discuss, and it did so at 4 o'clock in the afternoon while kids were eating snacks and doing homework. The tone was earnest, the acting was uneven, and the message was always delivered with the subtlety of a hammer. But the shows worked because they met kids where they were, on the couch with the TV on in the gap between school and dinner. The opening confession became a recognizable formula. The credits always rolled over a freeze frame of the main character looking into the distance, having learned a lesson. The after-school special was corny, heavy-handed, and occasionally brilliant, and it was the first time many kids saw their own fears reflected on a screen. Number 10. Weebles. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. The toys were small, egg-shaped plastic figures with weighted, rounded bottoms that made them impossible to knock over. Push them, flick them sideways, tip them as hard as you wanted, and they rocked right back to standing every time. The toy line launched in 1971, and it expanded quickly into play sets, the Weeble Treehouse, the Weeble Haunted House, the Weeble Cruise Ship. The figures had simple painted faces and smooth bodies, small enough for a toddler's grip and durable enough to survive anything that grip could do to them. The commercial jingle ran during Saturday morning cartoons, and every kid could recite it on command. The wobble was the entire toy. Nothing else happened. They tilted, they recovered, they tilted again. The engineering was elegant. A steel ball sealed in the rounded base kept the center of gravity low enough that physics refused to let them fall. Weebles were a lesson in persistence disguised as a toy, and the lesson never got old. Number 9. The smell of a vinyl car interior. Cars in the 1970s had seats, dashboards, and door panels made of vinyl that baked in the sun and produced a smell that was equal parts chemical and nostalgia. On a hot day, the vinyl was too hot to touch with bare skin. Sitting down in shorts meant a sharp burn on the back of the thighs, followed by the sensation of skin peeling away from the seat when you stood up. The steering wheel was scorching. The metal seatbelt buckle, if you could find it, branded a mark into any hand that grabbed it without thinking. But the smell was the part that stayed. Warm. Vinyl had a sweet, plasticky scent that mixed with the heat and the open window to produce a sensory profile that belonged to every family car, every road trip, and every errand run in July. Modern cloth and leather seats do not produce that smell. Nothing does. It belonged to a material and an era that have both been replaced. Number 8. The rooftop television antenna. Before cable and satellite, every house that wanted more than 3 channels needed an antenna on the roof. It was a metal frame shaped like a fishbone, mounted on a pole, and pointed in the general direction of the nearest broadcast tower. Reception depended on weather, altitude, distance, and luck. Adjusting the antenna was a 2-person job, one on the roof turning the pole while the other stood inside watching the picture and shouting instructions through the window. Turn it a little more. Stop. Go back. Right there. No, you went too far. The picture shifted between static and clarity with every degree of rotation. A strong wind could knock the antenna out of alignment, which meant climbing back up to fix it. Some homes had a motorized antenna rotor mounted on top of the television that let you turn the antenna from inside the house using a dial, which felt like a luxury. The antennas gave rooftops a bristling, mechanical look that has disappeared entirely from the modern suburban skyline. Number 7. Coming home smelling like chlorine from the public pool. The municipal pool opened on Memorial Day and closed on Labor Day. And for those 3 months, chlorine was the smell of summer. Kids rode their bikes to the pool after breakfast, stayed until the lifeguard blew the whistle for Adult Swim, and came home with red eyes, sunburned shoulders, and hair that felt like straw. The chlorine soaked into skin, swimsuits, and towels, and stayed for hours. A child who had been to the pool smelled like the pool for the rest of the day, even after a bath. The towel draped over the porch railing smelled like it for a week. The swimsuit hanging from the clothesline carried the scent until September. Nobody measured the chlorine content with scientific precision. The water burned your eyes, and that meant it was working. The pool was 3 feet at one end and 8 at the other, and everything in between was open territory for cannonballs, chicken fights, and staying under until your lungs gave out. Number 6. Bactine and mercurochrome. Every medicine cabinet in the 1970s had a small, brown bottle of mercurochrome or its cousin merthiolate, and every scraped knee in the neighborhood knew what was coming. The liquid was bright red, applied with a glass dauber built into the cap, and it stung with a sharpness that made the original injury feel mild by comparison. The red stain stayed on the skin for days, which meant that every kid walking around with crimson knees and elbows was wearing a visible badge of outdoor play. Bactine was the gentler alternative, a clear spray that claimed to be painless, which was mostly true, and it became the go-to first aid product for parents who were tired of chasing screaming children around the bathroom. Mercurochrome contained mercury compounds and was eventually removed from the generally recognized as safe list by the FDA. The bottles that remain in old medicine cabinets are relics of an era when the cure for a scrape was a chemical that modern safety standards would never approve. Number 5. Hide-a-bed. Every living room or den in the 1970s had a sofa that doubled as a guest bed, and the transformation from one to the other was a feat of engineering that required 2 adults and a willingness to suffer. The mattress folded in thirds inside the sofa frame, and pulling it out meant grabbing a metal bar at the front and heaving the entire mechanism forward while the cushions fell off the back. The mattress itself was about 4 inches thick, supported by a grid of metal bars that you could feel through the padding with pinpoint accuracy. High, the bar across the middle pressed into the lower back. The mattress sagged at the fold lines, and folding the whole thing back into the sofa the next morning was somehow harder than pulling it out. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, and every family reunion ended with someone drawing hide-a-bed. Number 4. The street hockey game. Every neighborhood had one. 5 or 6 kids, a tennis ball or a plastic puck, 2 goals made from whatever was available, garbage cans, sneakers, a pair of backpacks dropped 6 feet apart on the asphalt. The game started after school and stopped for one reason only: a car. Someone shouted the word, and everyone scattered to the curb, dragging the goals aside, waving the driver through, and yelling to hurry up. The game resumed before the taillights reached the stop sign. Nobody wore pads. Nobody wore helmets. The asphalt tore holes in jeans and left raw patches on knees. A stick to the shin was a foul that nobody called. A tennis ball to the face at close range left a red circle that lasted through dinner. The game ended only when the streetlights flickered on, or when a mother opened the screen door and shouted a first name that carried 3 blocks in every direction. Nobody argued. That voice meant the day was done. You grabbed your stick, said same time tomorrow, and went inside. Number 3. The smell of rain on hot pavement. There is a word for it now: petrichor. But in the 1970s, nobody had a name for it. They just knew the smell. A summer afternoon thunderstorm hit the pavement, and the asphalt released a scent that was part earth, part mineral, and part something that science has since traced to oils released by plants during dry periods. Kids stood under the carport or on the front porch and breathed it in. The rain came down hard and fast, filling the gutters and turning the street into a shallow river that ran toward the storm drain at the end of the block. Within an hour, the rain stopped. The sun came back, and steam rose from the road in visible waves. The air smelled clean in a way that it never did before the storm. That smell is one of the few things from the 1970s that has not changed. The rain still hits the pavement still releases it, and the people who grew up breathing it in still recognize it the moment it arrives. Number 2. Homemade Halloween costumes. Store-bought costumes existed in the 1970s, but most kids wore something assembled from the closet, the sewing box, and the kitchen. A ghost was a bedsheet with 2 holes cut for the eyes. A hobo was an old flannel shirt, a pair of Dad's pants held up with a rope belt, and burnt cork rubbed on the cheeks for a 5 o'clock shadow. A witch was a black dress, a pointed hat made from poster board, and green face paint. A pirate was an eye patch, a striped shirt, and a cardboard sword wrapped in aluminum foil. The costumes were obvious, imperfect, and deeply personal because someone in the house had made them. Trick-or-treating started at dusk and ended when the pillowcase got heavy. The candy was not inspected, the route was not supervised, and the costume fell apart a little more at every house, which was proof that the night had been a success. Number 1. The sound of the lawn sprinkler at dusk. The oscillating sprinkler sat in the middle of the front yard, sweeping back and forth in a slow arc, throwing water across the grass in a pattern that caught the last light of the day. The sound it made was unmistakable, a rhythmic ticking as the mechanism ratcheted through its range, followed by a pause at the end of each sweep, then a sharp snap as it reversed direction. Kids ran through it, dogs chased the spray. The water hit the sidewalk and pooled in the cracks. Inside the house, the windows were open, and that ticking sound drifted in with the evening air, mixing with the sound of a television and the smell of dinner on the stove. The lawn sprinkler at dusk was not a memory that anyone tried to make. It was just what happened every evening in every neighborhood for an entire decade. And then the decade ended, and the sprinklers kept running, but the kids who ran through them grew up and moved away, and the sound became something you had to remember because you could no longer walk outside and hear it. Every single item on this list existed without a password, a subscription, or a screen in your pocket. They ran on daylight, imagination, and the assumption that the world outside the front door was safe enough to explore without a plan. 100 items, and every one of them happened in plain sight. Nobody documented it, nobody expected it to end. It just did, one thing at a time, until a whole way of living had quietly moved on. Drop what you remember in the comments, and tell us what the list missed. Share this with someone who grew up on the same block, in the same decade, under the same sky. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. There is more where this came from.